Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling something pretty huge, the very essence of life itself. And this one's for all you philosophy fans out there. Get ready for some serious mind-bending. We're going deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on life. Now, it's a bit of a dense read, I'll admit, but luckily we have our expert here to help us break it all down.
It's going to be a fascinating journey for sure, exploring how philosophers throughout history and even today have grappled with this deceptively simple question. What does it mean to be alive?
Exactly. You might think, well, duh, I know what life is, I'm living it. But trust me, defining life is way more complicated than it seems. The article jumps right into this dilemma, and the first thing that hit me was just how tricky it is to actually pin down a definition. They use this great example, defining a bachelor.
It really highlights the challenge of finding those necessary and sufficient conditions, the ones that philosophers love to debate. You start with unmarried male, sounds like a good definition for bachelor,
That
right?
seems straightforward enough.
But then you think of, like, a 5-year-old boy, unmarried. Yeah, male, sure, but not really a bachelor, right? Or what about a widower? Fits the criteria, but doesn't quite capture what we usually mean by bachelor.
Yeah, it's like every time you think you've got it, bam, another exception pops up. Life is organized, sure, but so are crystals. Life processes energy, okay, but so does a fire. It's enough to make your head spin.
And that's where the philosophical debate gets really interesting. The article points out this tension between theoretical definitions and operational definitions. Philosophers, they're after those theoretical definitions, the ones that capture the true essence of life, the deep down nature of it. But scientists, they need something more practical, something they can actually use in their research.
So it's like philosophers are searching for the ultimate truth of life, while scientists need something that actually, works in the lab.
Precisely. It's a bit like the difference between, say, a dictionary definition of a word and how we actually use that word in conversation. The dictionary gives you a precise definition, but in reality, a word's meaning, well, it can be much more fluid. It depends on the context.
That makes sense. So how does this all play out when we're trying to define life? Does that mean scientists and philosophers are always butting heads?
Not necessarily, but it does explain why there's so much disagreement. And the article highlights some interesting alternative approaches to defining life, for instance, using prototypes. Think of it like the most typical example of something. So for life, you might think of a dog or a tree. It helps us categorize, but it's not a perfect definition.
So it's a kind of mental shortcut, but doesn't cover every possibility.
Exactly. And then there's the idea of exemplars, specific real-world examples that we consider to be the epitome of life. This could be a particular species or even a single organism.
So instead of trying to define life in this abstract way, we just point to a specific example and say that's what life is.
Exactly. It's a more concrete approach. But it still has its limitations. I mean, how do we choose which exemplar is the most representative of life as a whole? Then there's this fascinating idea that life might be best understood as a concept that's embedded within a theory. Kind of like how our understanding of water changed with the development of chemistry.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain this one to me, like I'm, a philosopher.
Well, imagine we're back in the days before modern chemistry. People knew about water, right? They drank it, bathed in it, sailed on it. They had a concept of water, but they didn't really understand its underlying nature. They might have defined it by its properties. Clear, tasteless, odorless, essential for life.
Right, but that's more of a description, not a real definition.
Exactly. And then chemistry comes along, and we realize that water isn't just some substance with certain properties. It's a specific molecule, H2O. And that changed everything. Our definition of water became much more precise, tied to a deeper understanding of what it actually is. Maybe our current concept of life is kind of like, pre-chemistry water. Perhaps we need a new theoretical framework, sort of life chemistry, if you will, to truly grasp what life really is.
Whoa, that is a mind-blowing thought. So are you saying all these attempts to define life are missing the mark because we haven't even discovered the basic principles that govern it yet?
It's a real possibility, and that makes this whole search for a definition even more intriguing, don't you think?
Absolutely. Now, the article also delves into how philosophers throughout history have grappled with this concept of life. And I have to admit, some of this stuff is pretty dense.
Well, keep in mind, these are some of the greatest minds in history, wrestling with one of the most fundamental questions we can ask. It's bound to get a little complex, but it's also incredibly insightful. Take Plato, for example. He had this three-tier system of life. Plants at the bottom, then animals, and at the very top, rational humans.
It's like he's ranking life forms, based on their level of complexity and intelligence. And it makes you think, is there really a hierarchy of life? Where would things like, say, artificial intelligence fit into that?
Exactly. It's a question that's still relevant today. And then there's Aristotle. He had a different take. He saw living things as having a specific form, material, and purpose, all working together. He even considered self-motion, that is, the ability to move oneself, as a key characteristic of life.
Self-motion. That's interesting. It's like it foreshadows our modern understanding of living systems as being, self-organizing and self-regulating.
Right. And it shows that even back then, these ancient philosophers were wrestling with the core principles of what makes something alive. They were laying the groundwork for our modern understanding of biology and even physics.
So even way back then, they were trying to figure out what separates the living from the non-living, what makes life so special.
Exactly. And it's a quorum that continues to fascinate us to this day as we explore the boundaries of life in new and often unexpected ways. Moving into more modern times, the article highlights just how many different definitions of life are out there. It's really pretty remarkable.
It's almost like everyone's got their own personal recipe, right?
Yeah, exactly. It mentions these attempts to categorize all these different definitions, breaking them down into groups based on how they define life, like whether it's through matter, energy, structure, even things like evolution and information.
Oh, wow. There's a whole philosophical buffet of options. But with so many different perspectives, it makes you wonder, why is there so much disagreement? I mean, are we just arguing over semantics here, or is there, something deeper going on?
That's the real question, right? And it gets to the heart of what we're even trying to do with a definition in the first place. The article suggests that, well, a lot of the disagreement stems from different assumptions. Assumptions about what a definition should even do, or, what features of life are truly essential, and even disagreements about the very nature of life itself.
So it's not just about finding the right words. It's about figuring out what we're even trying to define to begin with.
Exactly. And that leads us to, well, a pretty radical possibility. What if trying to define life is, a fool's errand? What if there is no single essence of life, no secret ingredient that makes something alive?
Wait, hold on. Are you saying we should just give up on defining life altogether?
Yeah.
That seems, I don't know, a bit defeatist, doesn't it?
Not necessarily giving up, but maybe we need to shift our perspective a little. The article talks about this idea of definitional skepticism, where some philosophers argue that this whole search for a single universal definition, well, it might be misguided. What if life, instead of being this clear-cut category, is more like a spectrum, a continuum of life-likeness?
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. So instead of saying something is either alive or not alive, we'd be talking about degrees of aliveness.
Exactly. And that opens up all sorts of new ways of thinking about things. Think about it like this. We used to group water, aqua regia, and aqua fortis all together as water until, chemistry came along and showed us their distinct compositions. Maybe our current concept of life is similarly too broad. Maybe it's masking a deeper, more fundamental truth.
So we might be stuck with this fuzzy definition of life until we have, a life chemistry breakthrough, something that reveals its true nature.
It's an intriguing thought, isn't it? And it makes you wonder, how does this uncertainty about defining life impact our understanding of things like, say, artificial life or synthetic life?
Right, because if we can't even agree on what life is, how can we possibly decide if something we create, in a lab or a computer simulation is actually alive?
Exactly. The article gets into this whole debate between strong and weak artificial life. The strong A-life people, they argue that if we can build something that perfectly mimics a living thing, like a robot or some complex computer program, well, then for all intents and purposes, it is alive.
So if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck, even if it's made of silicon and code.
That's the basic idea. But of course, there's pushback. The weak and A-life camp, they argue that simulations, no matter how sophisticated, they're just that, simulations. They might be really useful tools for understanding life as we know it, but they're not the same as actually creating a new form of life.
It's like the difference between watching a nature documentary about a lion and actually, encountering a lion in the wild.
Mhm.
Both can be informative, but the experience is, well, totally different.
A perfect analogy. And then there's this whole other world of synthetic life, sometimes called wetware. Scientists are literally tinkering with the building blocks of life in the lab, creating self-replicating molecules, minimal genomes, even trying to recreate the conditions for the origin of life itself.
Which, of course, brings us to that ultimate mystery, right? How did DD life begin? It's a question that has puzzled philosophers and scientists for centuries.
Absolutely. And the article traces the history of this question, starting with this idea of spontaneous generation, the belief that life could just arise from non-living matter. Like those experiments where people thought maggots just spontaneously appeared in rotting meat.
Yeah, until Pasteur came along and showed that life doesn't just magically pop into existence.
Exactly. Pasteur's work was a real turning point. It debunked spontaneous generation and, laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of biogenesis. The idea that life can only arise from other life.
Okay, so spontaneous generation is out. But then, how did life actually begin?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And it leads to a debate between, two main approaches to understanding life's origins. There's the bottom-up approach, where researchers start with the basic chemistry of early Earth, and they try to figure out how those simple molecules could have, assembled themselves into the complex structures of life.
So it's like trying to, I don't know, bake a cake from scratch. But you don't have a recipe. You've got all the ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, but figuring out the exact proportions and the steps to combine them, that's the tricky part.
I like that, a delicious analogy. And then there's the top-down approach, where scientists look at the shared characteristics of all life on Earth today, and they kind of work backward,
Yeah.
tracing the lineage back to a hypothetical last universal common ancestor, LUCA.
LUCA. Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. But it's amazing to think that all life on Earth, I mean everything, from the tiniest bacteria to the largest whales, it all shares a common ancestor.
It really highlights the interconnectedness of all living things, and it gives us some important clues about how life arose in the first place. And speaking of interconnectedness, what about the possibility of life beyond Earth? I mean, the universe is vast. It seems almost impossible that we're alone, right?
Right. I mean, statistically speaking, there have got to be other planets out there with the right conditions for life. And the article talks about the search for biosignatures, these telltale chemical signs that could indicate the presence of life on other planets.
Exactly. And this search has gotten incredibly sophisticated. We've got scientists using telescopes to analyze the atmospheres of distant planets, looking for gases like oxygen or methane that could be produced by living organisms. We even have robots on Mars right now searching for signs of past or present life.
And what about all that buzz about the potential biosignatures they found on Mars and Venus? The methane on Mars and the phosphine on Venus. They haven't found definitive proof yet, but it's still pretty exciting. And wasn't there that Martian meteorite? The one they found in Antarctica, AL84001, right? Some scientists think it actually has fossilized Martian bacteria.
It's definitely a controversial claim, but it's one of those discoveries that keeps the possibility of extraterrestrial life, right at the forefront of our minds.
And speaking of things that challenge our understanding of life, the article, it doesn't shy away from those fringe cases, those weird biological entities that blur the line between life and non-life, like viruses. They've got genetic material, they evolve, but they can't reproduce on their own. So are they alive or are they not?
That's a question that has divided biologists for decades. Some see them as a kind of, twilight zone organism, existing in that gray area between the living and the non-living. They even have this interesting characteristic, where they're almost inert until they infect a cell, and then suddenly they come alive, and start replicating.
It's like they need a host to actually be alive. And it's not just viruses, right? There are prions, those misfolded proteins that cause diseases like mad cow disease. They can evolve too. It really makes you question what we mean by life when even a rogue protein can exhibit some of its characteristics.
It really does. It's a reminder that the diversity of life, or at least life-like entities, might be far greater than we currently imagine. And it gets even weirder when you start thinking about life on a larger scale. Like, what about ant colonies or beehives? They exhibit this incredibly complex behavior, almost like a single organism, with specialized roles and coordinated actions.
Yeah, it's like the whole colony functions as a single superorganism.
Yeah.
And then there's the Gaia hypothesis, that mind-blowing idea that the entire Earth itself is like a living system with all its interconnected ecosystems and feedback loops.
It's definitely controversial, but it highlights how our understanding of life might need to expand to encompass these larger-scale interconnected systems. Maybe life isn't just about individual organisms. Maybe it's also about the complex web of relationships and interactions that sustain them.
Okay, so we've gone from the microscopic world of viruses to the planetary scale of Gaia. It's been quite a journey. But after all this talk about defining life, I have to ask, why does it even matter? What's the practical significance of all this philosophical hair splitting?
That's the key question, isn't it? And it's something the article really digs into. It's not just some abstract philosophical debate, you know? Defining life has real-world implications, especially when we start thinking about, ethics and social issues.
Well, absolutely. I mean, think about some of the most controversial topics we face as a society. Things like, abortion, end-of-life care, even the future of humanity with all these crazy new technologies like transhumanism. Defining life is right at the center of all of that.
Exactly. And as technology keeps advancing, we're going to face even more complex questions like, what about gene editing or artificial intelligence, the potential to create entirely new forms of life?
It's mind-boggling, really. But getting back to your point, the article stresses how important it is to make a distinction between life and other related concepts like
Mhm.
sentience, personhood, moral considerability.
It's a subtle but crucial distinction. Being alive might be necessary for something to have moral status, but it's not the only thing we consider, right? Like, we generally agree that humans have a higher moral status than, say, a bacterium, even though both are technically alive. And that's where those other concepts you mentioned come in, like sentience, the ability to experience feelings, and personhood, having self-awareness, the capacity for rational thought, that sort of thing.
So something could be alive, but not necessarily have the same moral standing as a human being.
That's right. And, as we move into this uncharted territory of AI and synthetic life, these distinctions become even more important. Like, if we create a machine that can learn, solve problems, even express emotions, does that mean it's alive?
Mm.
Does it deserve the same rights as a human?
Those are some really big questions. Sounds like defining life is just the first step. It opens up a whole can of worms, ethically and philosophically speaking.
It definitely does. And that's why these conversations are so crucial. We need to wrestle with these questions now so we're ready for what the future holds.
Well, dear listeners, we've taken a deep dive into the fascinating and often confusing world of life. We've explored its many definitions, its origins, its limits, and even its ethical implications.
We've seen how the seemingly simple question, what is life, has challenged thinkers for centuries, and it still sparks debate, still inspires new discoveries.
And as we wrap up, the article leaves us with a final thought-provoking question.
Yeah.
If we ever encounter extraterrestrial life or create an AI that truly seems alive, will our current definitions even be enough?
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Are our ideas about life just limited by our own experiences here on Earth? Or is there some broader, more universal concept of life out there waiting to be discovered?
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that, with a sense of wonder and a challenge to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep searching for the answers to life's biggest mysteries.